Mary Todd Lincoln was not a simple woman. She had a sharp mind, a quick wit, and a passionate heart. She also carried a lot of sadness. Before she even reached the White House, death was a familiar shadow in her life. Her mother died when Mary was young. Then, 3 of her 4 beloved sons died young, 2 before Abraham Lincoln became president, and 1 during his time in office. This was a common story in the 19th century, a time when doctors knew less and diseases could sweep through families with terrible speed. Children often didn't make it to adulthood. People buried their loved ones more often than we do today. This constant presence of death made people look for comfort anywhere they could find it. And in the mid-1800s, a new kind of comfort was becoming very popular in America's spiritualism. It wasn't just a fringe thing, it was a mainstream movement. Many educated, respected people, including scientists, writers, and even some politicians, took it seriously. They wanted to believe that their loved ones weren't truly gone, that they could still communicate with them. Spiritualism basically said that the spirits of the dead could talk to the living. Mediums were the go-betweens. These mediums would hold séances, which were gatherings where people tried to talk to spirits. What happened at these séances varied. Sometimes it was just simple knocks or raps on a table, supposedly from a spirit. Other times, mediums would claim to channel voices or write messages automatically or even make objects move. Some even claimed to make spirits appear, though this was often done in dark rooms with special effects. The movement really took off in 1848 with the Fox sisters in Hydesville, New York. They claimed to hear mysterious raps in their home. They said these raps were messages from a spirit. People flocked to see them. Soon, hundreds of mediums popped up across the country. They offered a promise an afterlife wasn't just a distant hope, but a present reality. You could talk to your dead child, your departed spouse, your lost parent. For a nation grappling with constant loss and soon to be engulfed in the unimaginable death toll of the Civil War, this promise was incredibly powerful. Mary Todd Lincoln was exactly the kind of person who would be drawn to this. She felt her losses deeply. She was prone to melancholy and had a dramatic nature. She had a strong belief in God and the afterlife, but she needed more than just faith. And she needed proof, or at least a sense of connection. Her grief was not a quiet thing. It was consuming. And when the worst happened in the White House, when her cherished son Willie died, she would reach for any handhold she could find, even if it was stretched out from the spirit world. Abraham Lincoln himself, though more of a rationalist, understood Mary's deep needs. He saw her pain. He knew she needed comfort, even if he didn't fully share her belief in the methods she chose to find it. He was a practical man, but he was also a loving husband. He just wanted his wife to find some peace. The true turning point for Mary Todd Lincoln and spiritualism came in February 1862. The Civil War was raging, bringing sorrow to countless American homes. But for the Lincolns, a personal tragedy hit them like a hammer. Their beloved son Willie, just 11 years old, fell ill with typhoid fever. Doctors in those days didn't have much to offer for such an illness. Despite all the care and prayers, Willie died on February 20th, 1862. This loss shattered Mary. Willie was a bright, lively boy, a favorite of both his parents. He was the one who often brought light and laughter into the often gloomy White House. His death was too much for Mary to bear. She had already lost 2 sons, Eddie and Henry, but Willie's death, right there in the White House, while her husband was fighting to save the Union, pushed her to the edge. She spent weeks in her room, weeping uncontrollably. She could barely eat or sleep. Her grief was a raw, open wound. In her desperation, Mary looked for comfort beyond the usual channels. She had heard of spiritualism. She knew about mediums who claimed they could contact the dead. For her, this wasn't some strange new fad, it was a lifeline. If she could just get a message from Willie, if she could just know he was okay, it might ease some of her pain. So, soon after Willie's death, Mary began seeking out mediums. She invited them to the White House. These weren't quiet, secret meetings in a corner. These were often held in the Red Room, sometimes in other parts of the executive mansion. People would gather, sometimes a small group of friends and family, sometimes with President Lincoln himself present. What happened in these seances? Well, the reports varied, but they generally followed the patterns of spiritualist meetings of the day. A medium, often a woman, would sit with the group. They might hold hands around a table. The lights would be dimmed, or even extinguished. Then, the medium would enter a trance. People present at these White House seances claimed to hear strange noises, raps, knocks, scratching sounds. Sometimes a table would move or vibrate. Voices would reportedly come from the medium claiming to be spirits. The most important voice for Mary was Willie's. She desperately wanted to hear from her son. She wanted to know he was happy in the afterlife, that he was still with her. One of the more well-known mediums Mary consulted was Nettie Colburn Maynard. She was a young woman who claimed she could channel spirits. Mary was very taken with her. Nettie would reportedly receive messages from Willie, telling his mother he was well and happy. These messages, whether real or imagined, brought Mary a temporary, fragile peace. These seances were a direct response to Mary's overwhelming grief. She was not alone in her sorrow, nor in her search for spiritual comfort. Many Americans, devastated by personal losses and the growing casualty lists of the Civil War, turned to spiritualism. For Mary, it was a way to keep Willie close, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between life and death, even if only for a few fleeting moments in a dim White House room. The stories of these seances quickly became part of the Lincoln legend, a testament to a mother's profound sorrow and her unusual way of coping with it. The stories of seances happening in the White House aren't just rumors. They come from several sources, people who were there or were close to the Lincoln family. These accounts paint a picture of Mary's desperate search for her dead son Willie and Abraham Lincoln's quiet, often skeptical, but always understanding presence. One person who wrote about these events was Noah Brooks. He was a journalist, a close friend of President Lincoln. He often spent time in the White House and had a clear view of the family's life. Brooks wrote about attending a seance with the Lincolns. He described it as a quiet affair, with a medium in a trance. He recalled the usual phenomena, raps, knocks, and the medium speaking in the voice of a supposed spirit. Brooks was a smart man, and he seemed pretty skeptical himself, but he also saw how much comfort Mary got from these sessions. He understood that she was heartbroken, and this was her way of trying to heal. Another important voice was Elizabeth Keckley. She was Mary Lincoln's personal seamstress and a close confidante. Keckley was an African-American woman who had bought her freedom from slavery. She was with Mary through some of her darkest hours. Keckley wrote a memoir, Behind the Scenes, where she talks about Mary's grief and her visits to mediums. Keckley didn't always attend the actual seances, but she was there for Mary afterward. She witnessed Mary's emotional state, her highs and lows, directly tied to the messages she received, or hoped to receive, from Willie. Keckley's account is particularly powerful because she knew Mary so intimately. She understood Mary's sorrow better than almost anyone. She said Mary was truly convinced she was talking to Willie. President Lincoln's role in all of this is interesting. He wasn't a true believer in spiritualism. He was a man of reason, a lawyer, a thinker. He liked to weigh evidence, but he was also a compassionate man, and he loved his wife deeply. He saw her suffering. If holding seances, if hearing supposed messages from Willie brought her even a moment of peace, he allowed it. He often attended the seances himself, not to believe, but to observe. There are accounts of Lincoln sitting quietly during these sessions, sometimes with a faint, amused smile on his face. He might ask a direct, logical question to the medium, trying to test what was happening. He reportedly once told a medium, "The only seance I ever attended with any degree of satisfaction was when I sent a telegraphic message from the War Department to General Grant." This shows his practical nature, his preference for real, verifiable communication. But he let Mary pursue her comfort. He understood that for her, the comfort was real, even if the source was questionable. During these seances, the mediums would often claim to channel Willie. They would say he was happy, that he was looking down on his parents, that he was with other deceased family members. For Mary, these were glimmers of hope in a very dark time. She would cling to these messages, replaying them in her mind. They gave her a reason to keep going when the weight of her personal grief and the nation's war felt too heavy. Some of these White House seances included other people too, friends, maybe some junior staff. These were not always deeply secret events, but they certainly weren't public spectacles. The Lincolns knew that such activities could be seen poorly by the public, especially during wartime. The image of the president's wife talking to ghosts might not inspire confidence in the Union cause. So, while not totally hidden, they were kept somewhat discreet. The accounts show a grieving mother, a tolerant husband, and a national movement trying to offer solace in a world full of loss. The Abraham Lincoln's involvement in his wife's seances is a really telling part of their story. He was not a spiritualist. He wasn't someone who easily believed in supernatural events. He valued logic and evidence. But he was also deeply empathetic, especially towards Mary. He saw her agony after Willie's death, and he was willing to do almost anything to ease her pain. So, when Mary started inviting mediums to the White House, Lincoln didn't stop her. He allowed it. He even attended some of the seances himself, but his presence wasn't that of a hopeful believer. He was more like a curious observer, sometimes a skeptical one. People close to him said he would sit quietly, watching. Sometimes he'd lean forward and ask a question, usually a practical or logical one, not necessarily designed to encourage the medium. It was almost like he was testing the boundaries of what was happening. There are stories where Lincoln would listen to the medium, and then if the message seemed a bit too convenient or dramatic, he'd make a dry, witty comment. He never openly mocked Mary or her beliefs, though. His love and concern for her always came first. He understood that these sessions, whether genuine or not, were a coping mechanism for his wife. They were her way of trying to connect with Willie, of finding some comfort in the face of unbearable sorrow. He was willing to humor her, to sit through what he likely saw as theatrical performances, because he knew it brought her a fragile sense of peace. But the political danger of these seances becoming widely known was very real. This was wartime. The country was in crisis. People looked to the president for strength, for rational leadership. The idea of the First Lady holding seances in the White House, trying to talk to ghosts, could easily be twisted by political opponents. They could paint the Lincolns as superstitious, as weak, or even as mentally unstable. Such rumors could undermine public confidence in the presidency at a time when national unity was essential. So while the seances weren't entirely secret, they weren't publicly advertised either. They happened within the more private spaces of the White House, with a relatively small circle of people. Lincoln was always aware of public perception. He knew he had to be careful. His public image was that of the stoic, resolute leader. Any hint of him or his family engaging in what many would see as foolish or unchristian practices could be damaging. Mary's mental state was also becoming increasingly fragile during this period. Her grief over Willie was compounded by the immense stress of the war, the constant worry for her husband, and the political attacks she faced. She was already prone to emotional outbursts and deep depressions. The seances were not necessarily the cause of her distress, but they were definitely a symptom of her desperate search for relief. Her reliance on spiritualism grew as her emotional state became more unstable. Lincoln's quiet patience throughout all this speaks volumes about his character. He put his wife's emotional well-being above his own skepticism or concerns about appearances. He allowed her space to grieve in her own way, even if that way was unconventional and carried risks. He was a man bearing the weight of a nation, but he also bore the private burden of a wife consumed by sorrow, doing his best to support her without abandoning his own principles. This balancing act was just one more immense challenge he faced during his presidency. Mary Todd Lincoln's reliance on spiritualism didn't end with Willie's death or Abraham Lincoln's presidency. If anything, it deepened. After Lincoln's assassination in April 1865, Mary was utterly devastated. This new, sudden, violent loss plunged her into an even deeper state of grief and mental anguish. She continued to seek comfort in the spirit world, often attending seances and consulting mediums even more frequently than before. For her, it was a way to communicate not only with Willie, but now with her beloved husband, Abraham. Her continued spiritualist practices became a notable part of her later life. As her mental health deteriorated further and her behavior became more erratic, her interest in spiritualism was often cited as evidence of her instability. In 1875, her only surviving son, Robert Todd Lincoln, initiated legal proceedings to have her declared insane. During the trial, her belief in and pursuit of spiritualism was presented as a significant factor in her supposed madness. She was briefly committed to a private asylum. Historically, the stories of Mary's White House seances have always been a curious, often misunderstood chapter. Were they real? Yes. By all accounts, they happened. Did spirits truly communicate? That's a question for personal belief, but what's undeniable is that Mary believed they did. For her, the messages, the sensations, the hope of connection were profoundly real and provided immense, albeit temporary, solace. The enduring impact of these events lies not just in whether a table truly knocked or a voice truly spoke from beyond. It's about understanding the human element. Mary Todd Lincoln was a woman under unimaginable pressure. She lost 3 children. She lost her husband to assassination. She lived in the White House during the most divisive war in American history. Grief, in any era, can push people to extraordinary lengths to find comfort and meaning. In the 19th century, with high mortality rates and spiritualism on the rise, turning to mediums was a common, often accepted coping mechanism. It was not as outlandish then as it might seem to some today. Mary's story, including her seances, is often used to paint her as Crazy Mary. But a more nuanced view shows a woman struggling with profound loss in a time when mental health support was almost non-existent. Her spiritualist activities were a reflection of her deep sorrow and her desperate need for connection and reassurance. She needed to believe that her loved ones hadn't simply vanished, that their spirits were still accessible. So, did Abraham Lincoln's wife hold seances in the White House? Yes, the evidence strongly suggests she did. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of her ongoing attempt to cope with unbearable grief, particularly after Willie's death. And Lincoln, though likely skeptical himself, permitted and even sometimes attended these sessions out of love and concern for his wife's emotional well-being. The seances were a poignant detail in the larger tragic story of Mary Todd Lincoln. They represent her personal struggle against the immense sorrow that defined so much of her life. They remind us that even in the highest office, the first family was not immune to the universal human experience of grief, and that in times of crisis, people often reach for comfort in ways that might seem unconventional, but are deeply human. Her story tells us about loss, love, and the enduring search for meaning beyond what we can see and touch.